Hi, and welcome to this new Liberal Club interview. This time we are honored to have a professor coming from the United States and Canada, Professor Fred Eidlin, who for 38 years taught at the University of Guelph in Canada, and is now doing courses and lectures at several universities in Belarus, Ukraine, Russia, Latvia, and the Czech Republic. Professor, welcome to this Liberal Club interview, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Looking at your incredible academic career and the lengthy list of your publications, I'm really tempted to ask loads of questions in this interview, but unfortunately we're limited by time. So let's go directly to a couple of things which I think look very controversial in our Belarusian context. A couple of days ago, you gave an interview where you drew parallels between civil societies in Belarus and Ukraine. And you said an interesting thing. You said that, in your opinion, civil society in Belarus has better foundations for a sustainable and healthier development. Why?
Okay. Well, first of all, I want to ask, what do we mean by civil society?
What did you mean by civil society?
Well, most of the discussion of civil society identifies civil society with NGOs, and sometimes with foreign-sponsored NGOs. And against that point of view, I say that, first of all, civil society is a very vague term. Scholars don't agree on what it means. And that one can argue that not only foreign-financed NGOs, but also government-sponsored NGOs, or it's a contradiction in terms, but that
NGOs, as we call them,
NGOs that receive money from government are actually anti-civil society.
So, but what is civil society then, your definition?
Okay, well, in America and Canada, in my two countries, and in Western Europe also, civil society is basically not political. So if, first of all, civil society is partly feelings in the bones of citizens about how if they don't like something, they just organize. There's no organization there, but spontaneous organization. But civil society, it would be things like Rotary clubs, Kiwanis clubs, chambers of commerce, churches that are most of the time just carrying on activities for the benefit of society without the permission of the government, without funding from anyone except their own sources and their own fundraising drives.
Okay, going back to Belarus and Ukraine comparisons. So if we take this broader definition of civil society, why is Belarusian civil society healthier and more sustainable?
Okay, well, the problem with civil society in Ukraine is that a lot of it is foreign-funded NGOs. And
in Belarus as well?
In Belarus, I think that most of the foreigners were kicked out, weren't they?
Well, they were kicked out. I mean, physically their presence is limited here, but still the majority of the NGOs that you hear about do receive foreign funding or internal funding from the government.
Right. But I guess my reaction to that would be that, is it not true that the ones that are left are more doing the kinds of things that NGOs do in America and Canada?
Well, again, we should probably look at different cases, case by case, but the point I'm trying to make is that I don't really see a huge difference in this respect between Ukrainian NGOs and Belarusian NGOs.
Oh, okay. Well, I might not be aware of the details, but my impression was that some of the NGOs that are problematic in Ukraine and also in Russia cannot operate freely in Belarus. That is, that politically oriented NGOs. Now, what's wrong with politically oriented? Like, aren't we Americans coming in to Ukraine and Russia and teaching them about democracy?
And aren't the Russians coming to Ukraine and Belarus and teaching us about their vision of democracy or statehood or...
Are they?
They are.
Are there Russian-funded NGOs?
Sure. Oh. Sure, and they are multiplying these days.
Yeah. Okay, well that makes sense because As I understand Russian policy, the Russians are competing with the Americans on the Americans' grounds. You know, like there used to be there is Radio Svoboda,
Right.
and now there's RT in Russia. And having been an employee of Radio Svoboda, Svobodna Evropa, I sometimes think RT is doing better than we did, you see. But in any case, that's good news. It's good news for all these countries, because what it means is there's going to be competition. So the Americans are going to be teaching you one version of democracy, and the Russians are going to be teaching you another view. The Russians are not spreading Soviet propaganda. The Russian point of view is that Americans are hypocritical. They don't take their own advice about democracy.
Right, but what's going to come out of this competition here or in Ukraine?
Well, the liberal view should be that competition is always good.
Right.
What it means is that people will tend to keep thinking the way they do unless something pushes them. And what is likely to push them is a live debate. See, so we're off on a little detour, but if I was unaware that Russian NGOs were starting to operate, but sounds like a good thing.
Right, but
competition.
Any predictions? What kind of civil society can we get? Is it going to be torn apart by the competition, or is it going to produce some new form of democracy? You know, sovereign democracy competing with some kind of ideal democracy.
Right. Okay. Now, one thing that I want to stress about social change in general, or movement toward democracy, is democracy doesn't come because the government decides that it's going to organize the state democratically. Democracy has been fought for throughout history, every step along the way. It used to be in America that only people with property had the vote. And then the vote was extended to people without property. Then the vote was extended to women. And every step along the way there was struggle. Vote for African Americans also. African Americans either couldn't vote or had trouble voting. That was also a struggle to get them the equal right to vote. Okay, so democracy is struggle, but in those countries that have succeeded, it's civilized struggle, right? I mean, you know, there's a tradition in the Russian Empire that I want to contrast to civilized struggle, which is it's immoral to negotiate with the regime because the regime is too immoral to negotiate with, and that the only solution is to kill the Tsar, and then everything will be fine. Okay, so I think that a very important role in democratic development is played not only by struggle, and I say civilized struggle, but also by events like what's going on in Ukraine.
Is that a civilized struggle?
Well, that's the point. Belarusians are going to look at Ukraine, at what's happening, and they're going to look at the outcome, and they're going to learn a lot from it. So if the Ukrainians succeed in reaching an ideal political order after the Maidan,
Which is?
well, where everybody has democratic rights and the Ukraine is like Western Europe and the United States. If that happens,
Right.
then I think a lot of Belarusians will be convinced that they should follow the Ukrainian model. If, on the other hand, the Maidan leads to political paralysis, economic problems, economic disaster, then maybe people here will think twice. There's an excellent book which I would recommend to everybody by the sociologist Barrington Moore. It's called The Social Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy. And Moore writes that the dictatorship of Oliver Cromwell in England played a very important role in the development of liberal democracy in Great Britain. Now that sounds strange, doesn't it? That a dictator would play a role in building liberal democracy. How's that? Moore says that because it was a dictatorship, it annoyed people. They didn't like it. But because it was a mild dictatorship, people weren't afraid to criticize it to each other in discussion. So what happened out of that is that this criticism of the dictatorship became part of British political culture. The way Moore puts it, it immunized the British with a lasting distaste for tyranny. Okay, so you can see that there are two things that I've talked about already. The one is that closing down foreign-funded NGOs is not necessarily a rolling back of civil society. It might be good for civil society. And I say not only foreign-funded NGOs, but also government-funded, because as soon as you get funding from outside your organization, you start looking to where the money is coming from for your aims and priorities. Right.
Priorities, right. But let me interrupt you here. But if we have a situation like what happened on the 16th of January in Ukraine, when the parliament basically passed a law that made it, well, let's say, difficult for foreign funded organizations to operate, but still didn't touch the NGOs, is that good for civil society?
Well, I'm not sure I recall the details, but I don't think it was prohibiting.
Not prohibiting,
it was registration of it. And the United States has long had the Foreign Agent Registration Act, and it's actually more strict than the Russian Act. I didn't read through the Ukrainian one. It's more strict because the Russian legislation doesn't prohibit, it just requires legislation.
Right, but does the American government sponsor any NGOs in a way that the Ukrainian government does, like in a non-transparent
Absolutely.
way? Non-transparent
the National Endowment for Democracy, for example.
Is it non-transparently funded?
The point is that in America, there's a big mix of kinds of funding. And there's a lot of government funding of private organizations which engage in activities that could be called political. So what's political? Right? Like you could say that if I just want to teach people about how to manage free and fair elections, it sounds neutral. You could say that's completely neutral.
Right.
But since there are elections are political by definition.
Sure, but these are nonpartisan things, aren't they?
That's what the Americans and the Europeans would say about their funding. They would say, these organizations that we're funding are not political.
Right.
We're just educating people in democratic skills, and then let the people decide what kind of government they want. But the opposing argument is that there are different views about elections and about what free and fair means, and some people would say that, wait a minute, if you have free and fair elections between two candidates, how about the way the candidates were chosen? See, the problem in the post-Soviet area is that who are the politicians who get involved in the first place, who become the nominees?
Who are they?
Who are they? Well, it's an open question, but I know that at first, after the Soviet Union broke up, in Russia, they were all people who had been communist functionaries. Like usually, the people who were popular, like people like Rutskoy, would just put up the flag and say, now I'm a Democrat.
Right.
And they were the candidates. So I'm leaving it as an open question, as I can't give you a comprehensive answer, but you answer it yourself and people who are watching this program.
Okay, now let's move to a slightly different issue. We've already touched upon it a little bit. In another interview or article of yours, you argue that the political model that we have in Belarus might be actually a good thing. What do you say? It might be the best of the worst.
Well, I'm saying when we look back 10 years from now at the three Slavic republics, which have similar culture, even though there are important differences, and we say, which of the three models worked the best? Now, of course, it's difficult because Russia has oil, there are differences in conditions, but there are three different models, So, for example, it was very important in Russia that the Russians used shock therapy, and very important that Belarus didn't use shock therapy. Okay, so what was...
Why important?
I'm going to say that.
Okay.
The reason why is ask a simple question. What was the result of shock therapy? It means that the people with power and money grabbed the property and the money.
But that's because it was done improperly.
Well,
if you
I
compare
meant
shock
that-
therapies in
yeah.
Poland and Russia, those are two different
Absolutely.
scenarios.
Well, okay, let's say I can agree with you, but whatever was done in Russia, if it was shock therapy done improperly, it was shock therapy in a way, and the result was that the people who grabbed the property are the ones who have the power today. It created a criminal economic elite, in a sense, where the power and the money are mixed, and it's very difficult to undo that.
Yeah, but what did it create here in Belarus?
Well, now let's turn to Belarus. So that did not happen. What happened? You have what I would call the slow transition model. The slow transition model, and actually there's a whole set of arguments, like, for example, my favorite philosopher, Karl Popper, who says that the only way to approach reform is step by step, right? Because each step along the way, you have to be able to assess the results.
Right.
And if everything is happening at once, you can't possibly assess the results and change direction.
Yeah, I see, but what worries me about this argument are basically two things. The first one is on the way to this gradual change, what he already had becomes rotten, and that's what we see here.
Right.
Like modernization, that's #1 slogan right now, is exactly the result of that. And secondly, the people who are in power, just because of unlimited mandates that they think they have, they are now not motivated to go for this change.
Right. Okay, good. So if we were to flesh out what you just said in greater detail,
Right.
Then we would have a criticism around which people could organize and say, here's a program, here's a proposal for how to change this. When you do everything at once with shock therapy, as it was done in Russia, there was no discussion. There was basically no understanding of what was being done, and the consequences were too broad and too deep to learn from them. So the result was simply that you got a criminalized apparatchik elite in Russia, and the problem is now, how do you undo that move? It's very difficult. Whereas here, you have all these problems, but it's much easier to do a detailed analysis and organize around a constructive alternative program. That's the argument. Now, I should add one other thing too, is that there was a big mistake both inside the former Soviet Union and abroad in expectations. So the expectations were the Soviet regime was an oppressive regime with a central commando administrative economy, and that's the cause of all the problems. So just undo that, give freedom, get rid of the fear, and everything will naturally start working. There will be democracy, there will be markets. What happened? Well, you know. And I think what that shows is that there was no easy solution.
And there is no easy solution.
There is no easy solution. The Soviet Union was a total mess. There was no real understanding of the mechanisms by which the Soviet regime worked, by which the economy worked. And there were no theories about how to transform this regime, and no previous historical experience. So some theories are relevant, like modernization theory is relevant, the theory of the market is relevant to some extent, but just look at the Soviet Union and you can see that it's not like wasn't like a developing country, because it was highly industrialized already, it had a high rate of education, a high rate of literacy. The problem of the Soviet regime was that it was not underdeveloped, it was misdeveloped.
Are we misdeveloped right now or underdeveloped?
Well, you've still got the legacy of the Soviet regime.
Yeah, but as I said, lots of that legacy has rotten.
Right.
Like the industry, we were proud of our industry.
Right.
And it's rotten now.
Okay, so now you know more about what needs to be done. precisely, you have a better possibility of discussing what needs to be changed and how to change it than the people who instituted shock therapy in Russia.
Professor, let me suggest this. Could you devote the last minute of our interview to tell us what should we do now, but in Russian?
But in Russian?
Yeah.
Okay, хорошо. Я не знаю. Значит, что для этого, для моего подхода, моя рекомендация, нужно очень много знать. Проблема реформы в любом обществе очень сложна. А есть разные мнения. Значит, я не могу дать общую рекомендацию из тех причин, что о которых уже говорил.
Давайте так, реформа в условиях сегодняшней Беларуси лучше, чем ее отсутствие?
Обязательно нужно реформировать.
То есть это не шекспировский вопрос?
Но я, когда читаю лекции студентам, я всегда предлагаю мысленный эксперимент. Завтра у вас есть встреча с президентом. Скажите, какие рекомендации вы бы дали президенту? Но не важно, если вы думаете, что он не будет слушать, но предполагаем, что он будет слушать. Какие конкретные рекомендации ему даете завтра? И тоже спрашивайте себя, есть оппозиция, или те, которые называются оппозицией. Вы довольны с их предложением для реформы? Не знаю.
Проблема Беларуси, как мне кажется, заключается в том, что как раз-таки предложений для реформы в основном нет ни как со стороны правительства, ни как оппозиции. Поэтому я думаю, что вот вы подсказали нам, что сделать, мы вас попросим остаться надолго в Беларуси и будем просить наше правительство давать всю доступную информацию,
значит,
чтобы вы посоветовали.
Надо ответственная критика, надо изучать конкретно настоящие проблемы и обсуждать возможные решения.
Профессор, спасибо большое за это интервью.
Очень приятно.